Trump can make before the jury in his federal trial related to the January 6th related case.
Naturally.
Prosecutors claim that Trump has tried to spread irrelevant disinformation and will try to politicize the trial. Specifically, Smith is concerned that
It's
Trump will
already
distract the
politicized.
jury by making claims of political prosecution, such as raising the question as to whether or not this legal case against Trump was launched in coordination with the Biden administration, or the question of whether or not there were undercover agents present at the Capitol on January 6th, or questions of alleged foreign interference in the 2020 presidential election. All of these topics, Jack Smith wants to be off limits at that trial, which is what he's asking of the DC judge. Meanwhile, proceedings in this case are currently on hold because of an appeal over the question of whether or not presidential immunity applies in this case. Meanwhile, Michigan Supreme Court today did rule that Trump can stay on the ballot in that state, rejecting an appeal to try to disqualify him. Michigan's court stated that they would not review the question as to whether or not Trump should be disqualified based on accusations that he incited an insurrection. This is the exact opposite from that Colorado ruling, which will likely go to the Supreme Court. We can expect to see several other rulings on this issue coming out over the coming weeks and months, as there are challenges to Trump's candidacy in several other states. Reporting in Washington, D.C., Melina Weiskup, NTD News.
They get tossed.
About 4.2 million people were, quote, suppressed, including 2 million during the Great Terror alone. Alexander Yakovlev, a reformist politician in the Soviet and Yeltsin eras, said in a 2000 interview that the victims of the Stalinist repression numbered at least 20 million. B. Atrocities of the Chinese Communist Party. From 1949, the year the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, regime was established, to 1966, tens of millions of Chinese lost their lives in the campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries, the 3 anti- and 5 anti-campaigns, the anti-rightist campaign, and the Great Famine caused by the Great Leap Forward. This period was followed by bloody struggles within the CCP. As a new generation of Chinese, raised to be atheist wolf cubs, indoctrinated in the education and party culture of communism, came of age, the communist specter launched a campaign of even more rampant killing and destruction to wipe out 5,000 years worth of traditional Chinese culture. The Great Chinese Famine. Between 1959 and 1962, China experienced the world's deadliest famine. To deceive the world, the CCP still claims it was, quote, 3 years of natural disasters. In fact, in 1958, the CCP had rashly begun the People's Commune Movement and the Great Leap Forward campaign. These wild schemes, which depleted grain stocks and decimated Chinese agricultural production, were supported by a deluge of false reports written by officials across all levels of leadership, from rural regions to the cities. The CCP used these reports as justification for collecting grain from the peasants, who were forced to turn in their food, seeds, and animal feed to the regime. The CCP's administrative organs at all levels sent teams to the countryside. They used torture and interrogations to squeeze the last morsels of food from the doomed peasants. Following the example,
streets, literally calling for the genocide of Jews, to shift the blame, take it away from them, and once again blame the Western societies. So in Germany, they came up with this narrative, well, it is not their anti-Semitism, it's our anti-Semitism, because we have failed to integrate them. Seriously, this is how you spin this now?
Well, was there an effort to integrate? Because I mean, it's almost like, at least in Canada and America to some extent, with this sort of idea of multiculturalism, it was like, it was seen as a racist or some kind of anathema to even think of that. Like, how could you try to assimilate them to our Western culture?
Right? I mean, first of all, the ones that a society should wants to integrate, the condition on that is, or the prerequisite would be the people wanting to be integrated, right? And I will have to say, in the 60s and 70s, there were a lot of Turkish people coming, and they wanted to work in Germany, and they did work in Germany, right? And the idea was actually they would come and stay for some time, work, and then go back. Well, that didn't happen, right? But now we are so overrun, and it's almost like you have these parallel societies. Why should they integrate? On top of all of that, we are being taught to hate our own way of life, to hate our culture. Why would anyone want to integrate in a society that hates itself?
Really?
It's insane. It's absurd. Like I said, on the altar of diversity and kindness and what have you not, we're actually destroying our liberal and free societies.
Christine Anderson, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
Well, thanks for having me. I had a really good time talking to you. Thank you.
By the end of the month, known as Red August, thousands of people in Beijing had been murdered. In the Beijing district of Daxing, 325 people were killed in 6 days between August 27th and September 1st across 48 production brigades of 13 people's communes. The dead varied in age from just 38 days to 80 years, and 22 families were wiped out completely. The Red Guards beat their victims with clubs, as well as stabbed or strangled them. They killed infants and toddlers by stepping on one leg and tearing the child in two. As the specter of communism directed people to beat and kill, it erased their human compassion, brainwashing them with the slogan of, quote, treating the enemy with the numb cruelty of the harsh winter.
I think he's too fried the year upbeat of Fox says of his disease, 51% is in 5% agree, 4% of the economic sees them. Have say they have heard them. In St. Croix, the president put more here in the books and listen of what he's saying cost jobs. Mentioned the big Wall Street, finishing up nearly 4% higher. Peaford Stephen over the year.
Down 9%, now we're down in inflation. That's still two people.
Inflation for a year high are still paying of houses. Americans need to extra $1 with bills of
less during the transition.
When President Biden returns to Washington, he faces a grueling re-election campaign in 2024. Mike?
Lucas Tomlinson reporting from St. Croix. Lucas, many thanks. Joining us now is Council of Economic Advisors Chair Jared Bernstein. Jared, welcome.
Thank you, Mike, and a happy and prosperous new year to you and all of our viewers.
Amen. From the Fox poll, in the next year, 22% say get better, 44% say they expect the economy to get worse. How troubling is that heading into an election year?
Well, I think on New Year's Day, a good place to start is let's look at what folks were saying last New Year's, at the beginning of this year. You had most financial outlets and many economists assuring us that a recession was inevitable and that the unemployment rate would have to rise many points in order to get inflation down. Go back a year and a half, and the price of gas was north of $5 a gallon. Today, as I sit and talk to you on New Year's Eve day, there is no recession. Unemployment has been below 4% for 22 months in a row. The price of gas this morning was $3.11 on average across the nation and below $3 a gallon in 28 states. Now, this combination of lowering inflation, and inflation is on a solid glide path back to its pre-pandemic rate, this combination of tight labor markets and easing prices has led to real wage gains. On a yearly basis, wages for mid-level workers have been beating prices for 9 months in a row. That's a trend, Mike, not a blip. Now, you reasonably ask, why isn't that reaching more Americans? Well, if we look at our two most closely watched measures of consumer sentiment, consumer confidence, they both rose big time in December. One was up 10%, the other a whopping 14%. Now, that's 1 month. That's not yet a trend. But it's certainly suggestive that the measures that this president is taking to help provide support and relief to families like the one he grew up in are working, and that people are starting to feel it.
More from the Fox poll, only 14% say they've been helped by President Biden's economic policies. 46% say they've been hurt. That helped number has dipped from December 21 and December 22. Why do you think Main Street may be so upset?
Well, look, people have been through a lot. over the past few years, a 100-year pandemic, a global supply chain snarl up that led to a global inflation. We've seen geopolitical conflicts and so on. And so I think some of that is definitely in the mix. But I think you have to look, yes, at what people say. And I pay a lot of attention
He's
to
a
that. They're the
Democrat.
best arbiters of their views of the economy. But I think we also have to look at what people do. Now, if you look at just the last couple of months, from November 1st to Christmas Eve, we saw spending at restaurants go up 8%. That's less than 2 months. We saw spending on online sales go up 6%. Overall retail spending up 3% in just a couple of months. This has been a very strong Christmas season. Look at entrepreneurship. We've seen huge gains in folks starting businesses, especially, by the way, people of color. I don't think you start businesses at this rate unless you have some optimism, some confidence about where we're going. So if you actually look at the trend in the economy, the strength of consumer spending, real wage gains for 9 months in a row, year over year for mid-level workers, I think you see some real momentum getting us in a good start for the new year.
You made reference to spending. In Lucas's setup piece, there was talk about the ballooning credit card debt in this country. Is that a potential?
Mute.
Beijing. The organization reportedly contributed $3.8 million to climate initiatives in the U.S. The receiver of such funds include agencies that engage with the White House on climate policy and advocate phasing out fossil fuels and natural gas. The group has significant ties to the CCP. Its current CEO is a former Chinese official, and some key staff members served in high-ranking roles inside Chinese state agencies and research institutions. Beyond that, executives tied to the nonprofit frequently meet with Chinese officials and CCP-linked institutes, reportedly to discuss what they call cooperation between the U.S. and China on climate issues. According to a 2017 press release from the Chinese regime, the nonprofit CEO at the time said the foundation hoped to further serve China's going global national strategy and participate in the work of the Belt and Road Initiative. As of 2015, the release stated the nonprofit had contributed a cumulative $240 million in grants to China. The organization receives its funding from private Western foundations like the MacArthur Foundation and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. The revelation comes amid an ongoing congressional probe into the CCP's growing influence on the American environmental activist movement. China dominates the green energy market. The country
to this planet. Radis and Kilgore, working with international investigators, published the report An Update to the Slaughter and Bloody Harvest in June 2016. Running over 680 pages and containing more than 2,400 references, it proved beyond any doubt the reality and scale of the live organ harvesting carried out by the Chinese Communist regime. On June 13, 2016, the U.S. House of Representatives unanimously passed Resolution 343, demanding the CCP bring an immediate end to the forced organ harvesting of Falun Gong practitioners and other prisoners of conscience. The lucrative organ transplant business sustained support for the persecution of Falun Gong and attracted clients from China and around the world, making them part of the CCP's mass murder. 4. Red Terror in Export. The introduction to the Black Book of Communism provides a rough estimate of the death tolls of communist regimes around the world. It verified a figure of 94 million, including the following: 20 million in the Soviet Union, 65 million in China, 1 million in Vietnam, 2 million in North Korea, 2 million in Cambodia, 1 million in Eastern Europe, 150,000 in Latin America, mainly Cuba, 1.7 million in Ethiopia, 1.5 million in Afghanistan, 10,000 due to, quote, the international communist movement and communist parties not in power. Apart from Russia and China, lesser communist regimes have shown themselves no less willing to engage in absolute evil. The Cambodian genocide is the most extreme mass murder carried out by a communist government. According to various estimates, the number of Cambodians killed
as well as participated in the FBI's investigations of Russian oligarchs. Those investigations included Oleg Deripaska, a Russian oligarch who was eventually placed on the U.S. sanctions list. However, being a shrewd Russian oligarch, Mr. Deripaska apparently had a secret weapon: 2 sympathetic FBI agents. Here's how the indictment from the Justice Department described what took place. Quote, while working at the FBI, McGonigal supervised and participated in investigations of Russian oligarchs, including Deripaska. In 2019, McGonigal and Shestakov is another FBI agent, they both worked on behalf of Deripaska in an unsuccessful effort to have the sanctions against Deripaska lifted. In 2021, McGonigal and Shestakov conspired to provide services to Deripaska. Specifically, following their negotiations with an agent of Deripaska, McGonigal and Shestakov agreed to, and did, investigate a rival Russian oligarch in return for concealed payments from Deripaska. Now, just to pause here for a super quick moment. What this indictment is alluding to is the fact that this FBI special agent, who was himself the one in the FBI investigating these Russian oligarchs, he left the FBI and he began to get paid by one of these very same Russian oligarchs in order to do several things: to try and get that oligarch off the sanctions list, and also to investigate and to dig up dirt on a rival Russian oligarch. Here is how the New York Times described the general situation. Quote, Mr. McGonigal's work on Deripaska's behalf, obscured by use of shell companies and subcontractors, involved seeking information about Mr. Potanin's business. Potanin was the other oligarch. The ultimate goal, prosecutors said, was to cause sanctions to be placed on Mr. Potanin, potentially leveling the playing field with Mr. Deripaska. But the plot unraveled within months after the FBI seized Mr. McGonigal's cell phone. And so what this Russian billionaire, Mr. Oleg Deripaska, did was that he paid Charles McGonigal through a bunch of different subcontractors and shell companies to investigate his rival and to find out whether he had any hidden assets outside the country, whether he had any non-Russian passports, and to basically use his FBI connections to dig up as much dirt as he could on this Russian billionaire rival. And it was very obvious that Mr. McGonigal knew that what he was doing was illegal, not only because he was at the FBI when the decision to put Deripaska on the sanctions list was made, but also because in his internal chats, McGonigal would make a point of not using this Russian oligarch's real name. Instead, in his emails, he referred to him as the big guy and the client. And well, it looks like this particular big guy got a lot more than 10%. Regardless, though, the indictment actually goes a lot further, and it lays out how Mr. McGonigal, while still working at the FBI in 2018, was introduced to an agent of this Russian oligarch, and then subsequently, Mr. McGonigal helped to get this agent's daughter placed into the Counterterrorism and Intelligence Unit within the NYPD. Quote, in 2018, while McGonigal was still working for the FBI, Shestakov introduced him to a former Soviet and Russian diplomat who functioned as an agent for Deripaska. That person is not named in court papers, but the Justice Department says he was rumored in public media reports to be a Russian intelligence officer. According to the indictment, Shestakov asked McGonigal for help getting the agent's daughter an internship in the New York Police Department's counterterrorism and intelligence units. McGonigal agreed and told a police department contact that I have an interest in her father for a number of reasons. According to the indictment, a police sergeant subsequently reported to the NYPD and the FBI that the woman claimed to have an unusually close relationship with an FBI agent whom, she said, had given her access to confidential FBI files. And so, in summary, the FBI agent who was investigating Trump for colluding with Russia was doing all this behind the scenes. He was colluding with one Russian oligarch to investigate another Russian oligarch, while also getting the daughter of the oligarch's agent placed inside the intelligence unit of the NYPD. That is, if nothing else, amazing. You sometimes really cannot make these things up. Regardless, as I mentioned at the top of the episode, Mr. McGonigal has now pled guilty, and as of 4 days ago, he has been sentenced to a 50-month-long prison term alongside a $40,000 fine. And if that sounds like a light sentence to you, well, here was the judge's rationale. Quote, Judge Jennifer H. Reardon said her sentence was designed to balance McGonigal's more than 2 decades as a law enforcement officer with the extremely serious nature of his crimes, which she said threatened national security, which is perhaps an understatement to say the least. If you'd like to go through the details of this entire story, including the full-length indictment that was released by the Justice Department, I'll throw a link to the PDF version of it down into the description box below. And until next time, I'm your host, Roman from the Epoch Times. Stay informed, most importantly, stay free.
Exceeding the combined emissions of all developed nations. Its CO2 emissions are roughly twice that of the United States each year. The U.S. was the second largest emitter at 11%. Meanwhile, the regime continues to rapidly approve new coal-fired power stations, building the equivalent of 2 new coal plants per week in 2022. China's CO2 emissions grew 10% year-on-year in the first quarter of 2023. One of the world's most sophisticated intel operations, according to the Wall Street Journal, the CIA is still working to rebuild its espionage network inside communist China. This comes 10 years after Beijing reportedly breached a spying operation and rounded up dozens of agents. All of them, including high-ranking CCP officials, were either killed or imprisoned. And today, under an intense surveillance system, gathering intelligence out of China is becoming a much harder task. Despite that, CIA Director William Burns said earlier this year that
Holy moly. Hours. So details have been released about the cause. Of course, that investigation continues tonight. Also tonight, it's a desperate search that's underway after police say a foreign exchange student from China has disappeared. Law enforcement agencies in Utah say Kay Zong was forcefully taken from a home he was sharing with his host family. Police believe the 17-year-old is being held against his will. He was last seen around 3 Thursday morning, but police weren't notified until 8 that night. Authorities have issued a missing person advisory notice to the community after the local high school said they were contacted by his parents in China.
The parents reported to school officials that they received a photograph of their child that would indicate he was abducted, and they requested a ransom. The host family was unaware that the juvenile was missing from the home, and they reported that seeing him the night before and hearing him in the early morning hours.
So far, a suspect has not been identified. Law enforcement agencies in Utah say they are working directly with the FBI, the U.S. Embassy in China, and Chinese officials. So to come, a cyclist hit and killed was honored this afternoon by